Here is an EOA Live LeGrand story.
Did you know that sunflowers are grown for seeds right here in the Grande Ronde Valley? And did you know they come in male and female genders? This is the first part of a story that we will be continuing throughout the harvest season to acquaint us with the farmers in the Grande Ronde Valley and inform us about growing and processing sunflower seeds.
So we got started growing sunflowers. Honestly, Rob and I were the first two, Rob Beck, and I had read all winter they were talking about high oleic sunflowers in all the farm magazines. It's kind of a funny story, actually. I intentionally waited till the middle of April to call Rob about it because I did not want to grow sunflowers that year. And I'll be damned if he didn't make one phone call, and he calls me back 2 days later and says, "You got to have 50 acres because I got a contract." And so it was just, we're always looking for new opportunities to grow seed, and once we got started, it was a crop that seemed to work pretty well in this valley. The first company that we worked with was really good. We had a couple failures off the bat, but they kind of took care of us, you know, from a financial standpoint while we learned how to grow the crop, and from there it expanded. And I know Rob now works at LSL Feed and Seed. They now work with 2 or 3 different companies, or have over the years, and so that's how we got started. Just a little bit of luck, I think, like anything. There's obviously large, I would say, multinational companies that produce sunflower seeds, but they're looking for local cleaning operations or local people that can kind of facilitate that and act as a, I guess for lack of a better term, a middleman between them and the growers. And LSL Feed and Seed is the company that does that in this area. And you know, one thing about agriculture and the seed industry in particular, it's really not a very big world. Once you start to get to know a few people, you find out it's a very, even though it's worldwide, there's just not a lot of players, and it's still an industry that's built on relationships, and once you get to know people, I think the word gets around, and so that's kind of how they find you. Obviously the climate in the Grande Ronde Valley is kind of unique, and so there are certain varieties that work well here, and I think over time they've figured out they're getting better at getting the right varieties to us. There's certain varieties that are longer season that they use, you know, I think they take those to California. It takes longer to get them from seed to seed, and the varieties we're growing here are a little shorter season. Cool nights, I think, is the biggest thing. We tend to cool down in the evening. It's a seed growing area. I mean, of course, grass seed, I think, was the first big one, and so you have a lot of producers that understand how to produce seed, keep fields clean. We're relatively isolated. One of the unique things for sunflowers that makes us a great growing area is we just don't have very many wild sunflowers. And if you go to other areas, they have a lot of wild sunflowers that grow in the ditches and the borrow ditches and along the banks, and that becomes a big problem for seed production. And for whatever reason, it's just not something that we have a lot of here. And that allows us to produce a real high quality crop. So obviously the first thing you have to do is you plant the sunflowers. Everything that we're producing here is hybrid production, which means we're taking 2 separate varieties and crossing them. I think the analogy that I like to use that most people understand is it's a Hereford cow and an Angus bull, and we're getting a black Bolly calf. So that's how it starts. The company will bring us the varieties. They'll tell us what the planting ratios have to be, and not every, but there are multiple different planting ratios. In this particular field, we're planting 6 females to 2 males, and that's to get the right amount of pollen to pollinate. One thing about sunflowers, most of the time we have to split plant, which means we don't plant all the seeds at the same time, and again, that will vary from variety to variety, but typically you'll plant either the female line or the male line, and then you'll come back 5 or 6 days later and plant the other. And that's to get the timing, which they call nick in seed production. That's to get the timing right so that everything doesn't bloom at the same time naturally. So we're trying to manipulate that in order to get all the flowers blooming at the same time. Once they're planted, of course, just the same as any other crop, it's about weed control, taking care of the plant, making sure you have good fertility. One unique thing about the sunflowers, or different than some other crops, is we have to have bees. So just prior to the flowers starting to bloom, we coordinate with the beekeeper and we'll bring in bees to do the pollination for us. Once the crop's pollinated, we'll come in and destroy the male line. So we have a small tractor that we'll come in with, and we'll run over the males and chop them up so that none of that seed ends up in the female production. Because we're looking, of course, to just provide the seed that they're looking for, and we don't want any cross-contamination. It's a full season crop, so harvest will come the end of September through November, depending on the year and the variety and all those things. They have to be extremely dry when you harvest them. They won't store very well if they have moisture in them, so that can be a real challenge. There's been times where we've had to dry, use mechanical or air and heat to dry the sunflower seed down. Then it'll go through the plant and they'll clean it, and then it'll be shipped to California, I believe, where they'll size it, treat it, and bag it. And then it goes all over the world. Some of the seed will go to the Midwest and be planted. A lot of the seed will end up in the Eastern Bloc. The former Soviet Eastern Bloc is what I call it. They grow a lot of sunflowers over there. There's two different kinds of sunflower seed. There's a confection type and an oil type. This particular variety is an oil. So it's being, the seed that we produce will be planted by someone else. They'll grow it out, and then it will be pressed for the oil. That will be the end product. Confections are the stuff that end up in David's or Spitz. We've also grown some of those varieties over the years. They're quite a bit different. They're tough to plant. Great big huge seeds is what they're looking for, which is great if you're eating them, but makes them tough to handle. Some of the nice things about the sunflowers, they're different rotation. We grow a lot of grass crops here, grass type crops, wheat, grass seed. So a broadleaf gives you an opportunity to work on those weeds, those grassy species. The thing I really like about them is they're not a big water user. So we're short of water on this farm, and so the opportunity to have a crop that doesn't use a tremendous amount of water is a huge benefit to me. Obviously they're pleasant to look at when they're growing. I mean, that's probably we grow a lot of different crops on our farm. This is by far the one we get the most calls about, comments about. My wife has a list of half a dozen people that call her every year wanting to know where they're at and when they're blooming so they can come take pictures. Lots of family pictures, kids' school pictures have been taken in our fields, and I'm sure everyone else in the valley is the same way. So it's been explained to me a couple times. I still don't get it, but somehow they've bred the female line to be sterile, so it does not produce pollen. And the male line will produce pollen and is viable to produce seed. And so the bees will, as they fly around, they're trying to get nectar, and the pollen sticks to their legs off the males. And then when they fly to a female plant and they're moving around, some of that pollen falls off, and that's what pollinates the seed, and that's how we end up with basically one variety pollinating the other. I mean, there's a bunch of technical terms for all those parts in sunflowers that I don't think most people are interested in, but that's the end of the day. The only difference is that you got to have a bee carry the pollen to the egg to fertilize it. So there'll be a percentage of every head that does not get fertilized. Typically, the center of the head, right in the middle, for whatever reason, a lot of times it will not get fertilized. So we'll do counts. This is a newer variety, so I don't know what it'll do, but we typically are looking for 80 to 85% seed set, which means 85% of the seeds are pollinated. And a sunflower, I think, most people think this is the flower. That is incorrect. Each individual seed is the flower. This is more of a receptacle to carry all the flowers. And so every seed is an individual flower that is individually pollinated and then produces a seed. Once the seeds are mature enough, you can crack them or squeeze them and tell. And then when we come through with the combine, the seed that isn't viable, it'll just be an empty hull, and you can blow most of it out the back of the combine. And whatever we can't blow out, they can definitely clean out at the seed plant because there's a tremendous weight difference between a hollow shell and one that actually has seed in it. Most of the confections, it seems like there's quite a bit of airspace inside. When you crack one open, the seed doesn't completely fill the shell. With the oils, I would say typically the seed pretty much just completely fills the shell. So although it's a much smaller package, you know, there's quite a bit of meat in there. So harvest is done with just a regular combine. The only modification you really have to make is we do run a special header. It doesn't have a reel, which most people would see is the part that goes around and pulls the wheat into the wheat or the grain into the head. With the sunflower header, you don't have that. There's a set of pans. I guess a few guys are running some reels, but ours doesn't. We cut with just a set of pans. All the pan does is catch the flowers that fall away from the header when you cut them off, because of course if the head's leaning away from the combine, when you cut it, the weight makes it fall away. The pans just help keep those from hitting the ground. They're relatively easy to combine. Crack is the biggest problem. Because you harvest them so dry, it can be really easy to crack the seed. Any seed that's cracked is not good. It's not good to plant for the subsequent crops. So that's probably the biggest challenge we face, I think, in harvest is the crack, and then the weather. Anytime anybody that lives in Union County knows once you get past Labor Day, things can get dicey. And so when you're out here in October trying to get a crop dry, I mean, it can be very challenging and very stressful. You know, I don't know that everybody realizes that the average farmer puts everything that they've done their entire life, they put it all out there every year. And if you're sitting here in October and it's raining and you don't get paid unless you get hard, it doesn't matter how hard you tried or how hard you worked, if you don't make a crop, you don't get paid. So I would say that's the biggest challenge is just being patient and waiting for them to actually get dry. One of the other things about bees and pollen is bees travel a long ways. So the state of Oregon requires that any unique sunflower field be isolated by 1 mile from another sunflower field. And that is because the bee can travel that far, they can collect the pollen from a different plant and then end up back in your field. That's also true if you have sunflowers in your yard or your garden. And so we spend a fair amount of time talking to people around us, letting them know. We've had to ask some people to remove sunflowers. We try to be real proactive and get ahead of the curve, you know, and let them know, hey, we're gonna have some sunflowers. A lot of times if we have the opportunity, we'll give them a little bit of the actual seed we're growing in the field. That way they can still have a sunflower in the yard. But you know, 15 or 20 sunflowers, those nice big giant ones that get 7 feet tall, if they end up in our seed, if the pollen ends up in our seed, it'll fail and we won't get paid. And so you know, we understand that it's hard to, my wife's a big gardener, and it's hard to ask people to not do something they want to do, but it can have a big financial impact on the growers. And so, you know, like I say, I think most of the guys try to be proactive and get ahead of the curve before they see them, but we miss them once in a while, and then that's when it's tough, when you got to go to somebody and say, oh man, I didn't notice those sunflowers. Is there any way, you know, we could take those out? And I'll be honest, most everybody I've had to talk to has been wonderful, and it's very appreciated. You know, we let them know there's 100 acres out here, and they can come cut 8 or 10 for their vase on their table anytime they want, and that usually helps. Little honey doesn't hurt either. So the actual end product will be the seed in a shell that's in a bag for another farmer to buy and grow. So we are strictly producing seed for other growers.